All right, here's the second assignment. This assumes that you've completed the first assignment, although it's a little bit tangential in that it focuses on one particular feature of the application and shouldn't have a lot of impact on the rest of the application. So we're going to be focusing on implementing the user management portion of the application, where a system administrator might go and create new users, remove users, change their properties, and all doing it dynamically, right? Dynamic from the client's point of view, from a browser's point of view, since we don't really have a server or a database to store any of this information. It'll be dynamic on the browser, so that the content will change dynamically. We'll be able to add content, remove content, change content. But once you reload the page, all those changes are gone, because we don't really have a place to store any of that, any of your changes, to make them permanent. Yes. Once we introduce web services and persistence, then we'll be able to store the changes permanently. All right. So we'll have to come back a little later and make this a little more for real. Right, but again, this is the way we're going to be introducing more and more complexity into our project. So we're going to, all throughout, obviously we're going to be learning about more HTML, more styling, Bootstrap and whatnot. But the real focus of this week is introducing JavaScript as a programming language, the browser programming language. Although JavaScript has gone beyond just being a browser programming language, right? Now you can find it also on the server, executing on the Node.js framework. So it's kind of like taking over the world. You know, the client side, the server side, the database side also. It's kind of like everywhere now. In particular, we're going to be using JavaScript to manipulate the document object model, DOM. We'll first see how to do it with JavaScript, but we'll quickly transition to jQuery. It's a very popular JavaScript library that allows us to target multiple browsers, so we don't have to deal with the idiosyncrasies of individual vendors. Then we'll talk about how to represent data using the JSON, the JavaScript object notation, and all throughout we'll always be talking about how to model data using UML. All right, so we're going to be building the user admin portion of the application. As an administrator, I like to be able to manipulate users, instances of users, so I like to be able to log in as an admin, navigate to an admin, and list all the users that are currently in my system. I should be able to create new users by using this form at the top, and creating plus, and adds a new row at the bottom with the new user that I've created. I can delete an existing user by clicking X right next to it, and it's removed from the data store. I can select a user for editing, and when I select them, their information is copied to the form. I can then change their information, and then click on the OK on the check box here, and then the changes are made here permanently. I can also filter and type in maybe a first name or last name or portions of it, and it'll filter those users that match that criteria, or change the role and retrieve only those faculties or students by clicking on the search. Right. So all this we're going to be doing it with jQuery. First we'll play around with JavaScript, but again, quickly move on over to jQuery. Right. So all the components that we're going to be building, the files that we're going to be building using, they're going to be following a convention, naming convention, and the convention will be that all files should follow this convention, unless you have a better convention that you've learned at your place of employment or from a co-op, or that you've worked with other teams. But if you don't have one, please follow this naming convention. It's the feature you're working on, in this case a user admin. feature, the role of this file, whether it's it's styling, whether it's some dynamic HTML template, or whether it's a logic in JavaScript. So that's the role of the file in the application. Whether this is executed either on the client or it's executed on the server, and obviously the type of the file. For our particular case, the user admin page, that particular admin is going to have three components. First, the HTML template. Template meaning that it's going to be mostly static, but it's going to have some portions that are dynamic, right? That some logic, some JavaScript is going to take control over that HTML and make it dynamic, right? So maybe it's going to grab a row in a table and may copy and paste it over many times, for instance, or change or read elements from a form. So it'll be dynamic, right? It's not static HTML, right? It's meant to be manipulated by some JavaScript file. Also, here's style. This is a styling file that it's applicable to that particular HTML template. So you'll have an overall style file, maybe, and here are some overrides that apply to that one particular HTML. And here's a JavaScript that goes along with that particular template that is meant to interact with that HTML, so it can grab content from the HTML, it can generate content inside of that HTML dynamically, again, using logic from within that JavaScript. What else? Data will be provided by a service file that it'll live in a particular directory called in a service directory. And again, same naming convention. Here we are providing data for users. So all the data for existing users will be provided by this file. So its role is to be a service, to provide data as a service. It's executing at the client. Typically, this service would go out to the server, right? It would make an HTTP request to some remote server, asking for all the users, and then it would provide it to the component, and the component would then dynamically render the content in the HTML. Right. Right now we don't have a server, so instead it'll be some static JSON file that will be some array that we will provide. We will provide a static array of users. Okay, and so the servers will be responsible for retrieving that JSON file, manipulating, adding, removing, updating, creating new instances into that JSON data representation. Instances of users will be modeled in this JavaScript file. So this will be a class that will allow us to instantiate new users, read new users, and manipulate users in this JavaScript. Okay. What else? Yeah. So this just explains the naming convention that we'll be following for our files. The templates that we're going to be providing. Here's a startup. Here's a to get you started. You're free to use this, or you can use your own if you prefer. But the template just gives you links to Bootstrap in the CDN. Also gives you links to jQuery, the latest jQuery library there. Also it gives you a reference to the service file. Right, so that it will provide data to the template, and also provides links to the component file, which is responsible for dynamically manipulating this HTML. Okay, so this is a start just to get you going. In there, you need to render something like this, right? This HTML, which I think we got started last week, didn't we? I think we might have gotten started with a table that looked like something like this. So you're free to use that. I've pushed everything in repository, and you're free to use that to get you going. Let's see, what else? Right. So this is the template. Also notice the file structure that I am asking you to please follow. So all the everything about the feature of administrating users should live under a directory called admin. And under there, you should find user admin template, user admin component, user admin CSS. Everything should live under there, except the service. All services got to live under services directory. Okay, so any data services should live under services. All components, HTML, template, CSS should live under a dedicated /admin. Login should live under login. Register should live under register, and so on and so forth. Right? Each feature should live under its own directory. Let's see. To get you started with the table heading, here's just a snippet of what you might use for the table. Although we did some of this last week, you can use that instead. For the template, for the form, here's something to get you started, what the form might look like. Also notice that I am giving specific names to these input fields. Please use these IDs, right? Because the TAs are going to be using these IDs to be able to automatically grade your assignment. So if you use some other ID, then their scripts will break. Right? So these input fields, you can style them any way you want, but please use these IDs. All right? All right. So these are the input fields at the top of the form of the table. Is this form up here? Okay. So all these input fields have specific IDs associated with them. All right. So please stick to those IDs. Yeah. So username field, password field, first name field, last name field, role field, and whatnot. Okay. These classes are for Bootstrap. If you're using another styling library, okay, some folks are using Material. That's fine. If you prefer to use that library, then use an equivalent CSS class. All right, but please use that ID. What else? On the right-hand side, you'll find some of the Font Awesome library for those icons, right? So for the search, right? For the FA search, FA plus, FA check, right? Those are the icons on the right-hand side of the form. Also notice that these have specific classes for these for these elements. Please use those classes. Right? They're not styling, but they're useful for the scripts that the TAs are going to be using. Right? So please use those classes. They're not styling anything. It's just so that the TAs can grab on those elements. These are the rows. The rows for rendering each one of the users in the table body. So these are the rows right there. Notice that there's a couple of classes in there. Webdev template for each one of the elements, columns in the table. We have the first column has webdev username, webdev first name, webdev last name, webdev role, webdev classes. Please keep these classes, since again the TAs are going to be using them for automating some of the grading. You're free to add other classes, right, to style them. Right, but please have at least these classes there. What else? This is again a reminder to commit your work as you go. Right? Don't wait till the very last minute to commit everything. Push it to your repository. Again, no. There won't be. I don't want to hear excuses that you lost your code or somehow your environment is not up and running. Code should always be in source control, and you should be able to, rebuild everything from anywhere on a moment's notice. Styling. This is just some wording on styling, and just some links to either Bootstrap or whatever other CSS library you're using. Linked into the head of the HTML document. Here's just to get you started on the user model class to be able to instantiate users using a plain old JavaScript file. right? We'll be transitioning to ES6 next week, or maybe at the end of this class, today's lecture maybe. But this is how you build classes using plain old JavaScript, right? You have a constructor, you have arguments that are being passed. If you see that I'm missing an argument here, maybe like role or email, feel free to add your own. Right? If you see I'm missing a field, feel free to add them yourself. Here's some setters and getters and the fields. Let's see. Then you have the component. The component is going to play a little bit the role of the controller in an MVC design pattern. Right? It's going to be responsible for listening for event handlers, right, for users as they interact with the user interface. Right? So the component is going to be playing the role of listening for those interactions as the user clicks and drags and interacts with the user interface. It's also going to be playing the responsibility of interpreting those actions and acting on a model, right? On either adding or removing or updating the model, yes? And as that model changes, then providing new data for the user interface to update the user interface, yes? So the controller is going to be, this component is going to be playing that role, right, of the controller in an MVC design pattern. It's going to be implemented in the user admin component.client. Let's see. So in that file, it's going to look like this. It's going to look like this. Excuse me. Notice that it's a function. It's an anonymous function that has its own curly brackets here. So it's going to be declaring all its private functions in here to manipulate the model and provide all the behaviors that it needs. And notice that it's an immediately invoked function. See that? That's a common pattern. It's called the IFI pattern, the immediately invoked functional expression. We'll see that in a minute. That helps with dealing with avoiding name collisions, right? Since when you declare in the head, you start loading lots of libraries. The jQuery library, the Bootstrap JavaScript library, all these libraries. Okay, all these libraries are competing for the same namespace, right? The web page declares its own namespace, and each library can declare its own functions, its own variables. Okay, and we don't want to be competing with that namespace. Right? We don't want to declare a function that we inadvertently override somebody else's function, or we don't want to declare a variable that inadvertently overrides somebody else's variable. Right? So what this expression does is that it creates its own little namespace, right? And so we're not overriding anybody else's namespace. Yes, right? Today in ES6, we don't need to do this anymore since it supports modules, right? It supports packages. So you can declare your own namespaces, and you're not clobbering anybody else's namespace. But regular JavaScript doesn't support any of that, right? So yeah, this is the way it's the old way of supporting modules and packages and whatnot. Yes. So it's good to learn it. You'll see it still being used quite often. So yeah. So this component also declares lots of variables in here. These are variables that are going to be bound to domain elements in the template, in the HTML template, okay? So that we're going to be able to refer to the user field in the HTML template. We're going to be able to refer to all the buttons, the remove button, the edit button, the create button. We're going to bind these, right? We're going to bind them so that we can programmatically listen for click events, yes? And we can programmatically handle these events here in the component. All right, so we're going to do that. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And here's where the component gets started, initialized, to doing all these bindings. All right, we're going to be doing that in the main function here. Also here, another thing that we're going to be instantiating here is the user service. This is the service that's going to give us the data. These are going to be the event handlers. So if we click on the button to create a new user, this is the function that's going to do it. Okay, when we click on the X right, to remove a particular user, this is the function that's going to be called, right, to actually handle the removal of a user from the list. When we click on the pencil, right, and we select a particular user to be edited, that's the function that's going to be called. When we actually modify the user's first name, last name, and whatnot, or role, and we say OK, that's the function that's going to handle that. So these are all event handlers, right, that are going to be interpreting all the user's use cases and as they interact with the user. These functions are going to be responsible for actually manipulating the DOM, right, to render a particular user or render a list of users, right. So we're gonna be encapsulating this. So your task, if you choose to take it, is to replace your these dots with actual code, right? And we'll get started today. We'll get you started here in class, and you'll fill in the blanks. All right. Okay. What else? So here's a description of each one of those functions. And here's the service client. So this class here, right here, that is being referenced here, the admin user service client, which is also being included right here. Admin user service client, right? So that looks like this. Looks something like this. Here it is. Oh, I named it wrong. What did I call it here? That. Admin user service client. So this should be admin user service client. There we go. Yeah, so what it does is that it's a class, and it declares these five functions, and they are the ones responsible for providing and actually manipulating the data. Right? The component is not responsible for manipulating the data. It's responsible for delegating to the service client to manipulate the data. Right? So this is the single point of entry to the data. Right? Any operations on the data goes through the service client. Right? Now it's a client because ideally it would be going to a server. Right? It would be telling the server and eventually the database to actually insert a user into a database, but we don't have that yet. Right, so for now, it'll be doing everything internally with some static data for now. Okay, and this, so we'll give you an array of users, right? Some dummy users. Right, so Alice, Bob, Charlie, Dan, A, B, C, D, and so find all users will return that array. Right, but create user will push into that array. Right, so we'll add elements to that array. Delete user will find the user in that array and will remove it. Eventually, we'll replace this so that it does a post, a put, a get, a delete, HTTP over to the server. Right? But we'll do that a little later. For now, we want to learn how to do DOM manipulation. Okay? All right. So here's a description of all these functions. So your deliverables is for you to have this up and running on your server. Okay, what the TAs will do is that they'll clone your code. They'll have some scripts that that will automatically, click on your buttons. Right, will push your buttons, and will verify that a new user was created, that they were able to update that user, where they were able to delete the user, they were able to find the user. Right, they'll have some scripts that will automate that validation. Make sense? Everybody okay? All right. So let's get started.